There is a gospel truth that permeates both testaments of the Bible. And it is that from eternity to eternity, God has this relentless desire in him to dwell among you physically and visibly. We can only imagine the results of the fall in the Garden of Eden, how that affected God. So often our focus is on how the fall affected us, right? All of the sin, our brokenness, our sicknesses, our death, pain and childbearing, tension now between husband and wife and each other, and not just physical death, but spiritual death. But many times I think we underfocus on how the fall affected God. At the beginning of Genesis 3, we have this picture there, you can see it, of God walking to and fro in the Garden of Eden in the cool of the day, physically, visibly in our midst. But by the end of the chapter, because of the fall, Yahweh God sent Adam and Eve out from the garden. Imagine that impact on God, who from eternity has had this burning desire to just have you dwell with him and him with you. But now, because of the reality of our sin and uncleanness, it couldn't be like that any longer here. Let's fast forward now to the mid-1400s BC. God in his faithfulness has acted to deliver his people out of slavery in Egypt, and he has brought them to Mount Sinai. And there, Moses goes up to Mount Sinai, and God begins to give him the first 5 books of this Bible. And as part of that revelation, God reveals these very detailed blueprints and measurements for what you see on the screen, this tabernacle, or literally it means a tent. And by this tent, that relentless desire of God to once again dwell physically and visibly in the midst of his people would be partially met. And so you had 3 tribes on one side, and 3 of the 12 on the other side, and 3 of the 12 on this side, and 3 of the 12 on the other side. So literally, God in the midst of his people. And once Moses finally assembled all the supplies and they got this tent erected, look what happened. The cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle. Moses was not able to enter because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of Yahweh filled the temple. That's the kavod Yahweh, the glory of Yahweh. The glory of Yahweh in the Bible is the overwhelming heaviness of his real presence. And it was so heavy when it came upon the tabernacle that day in the midst of the Israelite camp that even Moses, who had talked with God face to face on the mountain, could not enter. And the glory of God in the Bible is often associated with a cloud and with lights. And so there was a manifestation of God dwelling in the midst of his people once again, visibly and physically, through the pillar of fire by night that was over the tabernacle, and then a pillar of cloud by day, showing that Yahweh was there. Let's forward another 500 years. King David said, wait a minute, I'm living in a king's palace in Jerusalem, and God Almighty is still in this tent. That doesn't seem right. So David had it on his heart to build a temple for God, where his glory could dwell. But God said, nope, it's not going to be you, David, but it will be your son, King Solomon. And as soon as King Solomon finished building the temple in Jerusalem in 957 BC, and they had this dedication ceremony for the temple in Jerusalem, look what happened. When the priest came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of Yahweh, so that the priest couldn't stand to minister because of the cloud. For the glory of Yahweh filled the temple of Yahweh. His overwhelming divine presence filled that temple in Jerusalem. Yahweh was there. Let's fast forward another 400 years, and we're going to come to the three saddest verses in the whole book of Ezekiel that we are working through. And you could even argue that these are the saddest verses in all of Israel's Old Testament history. Here's what Ezekiel sees. He sees the glory of Yahweh go up from the cherub. That's above the Ark of the Covenant in the most holy place of the temple. And the temple was filled with the cloud and with the brightness of the glory of Yahweh. Then the glory of Yahweh went out of the threshold of the temple. What just happened in Israel? The glory of Yahweh that filled the tabernacle, the glory of Yahweh that filled the temple, just left. So while his people are hundreds of miles away in captivity in Babylon, news was received that the glory had indeed left. And Babylon completely leveled the temple to the ground and burned it. Can you imagine the heavy, sunken hearts of God's people? Not that they were so far away from the promised land, not that the temple had been destroyed, but that the glory of Yahweh was no longer in their midst. That's why last week Pastor Micah described this vision of the Israelites as a really big valley of lifeless, dry, dead bones. Because the glory of Yahweh had left. So for the rest of the Old Testament, there's this suspense. Will the glory of Yahweh ever come back to the temple? In the last 8 chapters of Ezekiel, God gives Ezekiel this incredible vision of a new temple. And again, all the measurements, as you can see, are very precise. And then as Ezekiel is getting this tour by this heavenly guide of this new temple, you can imagine the elation when Ezekiel then receives this in his revelation. The glory of Yahweh came into the temple by way of the gate that is facing east. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into the inner court. And behold, the glory of Yahweh filled the temple. And God spoke to him himself from that inner court of the temple and said to Ezekiel, they have defiled my holy name by their abominations, so I have consumed Israel in my anger. Now let them put away their whoring after false gods far from me. And here's that relentless desire. And I will dwell in their midst forever. So this new temple and this glory of Yahweh coming back again. Would it happen? And when? Well, God is sovereign over everything in the creation, even among foreign kings and foreign armies. And so God did raise up a new order to take out Babylon. And God put it on that king Cyrus's heart of Persia to let God's people go back from Babylon to Jerusalem and rebuild it, especially rebuild the temple. And they immediately started work on the temple reconstruction, and it was finished in 516 BC. But the glory of Yahweh never entered this rebuilt temple like it had with the tabernacle and Solomon's temple. And so we're left again with that tension, that suspension. Will the glory of Yahweh ever come back to the temple? Whenever we are working through biblical prophecy, as we are really going to do this week and the next 2 weekends in Ezekiel, we have to take all these Old Testament prophecies and filter them in Jesus Christ. All the Old Testament prophecies find their meaning and fulfillment in Messiah, who is Jesus. And so would the glory of God ever return to the temple visibly in the person of Jesus Christ? Let's go to John chapter 1 and 2. John says, the Word Jesus became flesh and tabernacled among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. And then the next chapter, Jesus tells the Jews, destroy this temple, meaning his body on the cross. And Jesus said, in 3 days, I will raise it up. And he did that on Easter. But what do you have here in Jesus? The tabernacle, temple, the glory of Yahweh, all come together in the person of Jesus Christ. And so would the glory of Yahweh enter the temple again? Do you remember when the glory left in the early chapters of Ezekiel? When it left the temple and it left the city of Jerusalem that day, at least in that moment, it didn't go right back up to heaven. Look at what Ezekiel says. The glory of Yahweh went up from the midst of the city, Jerusalem, and it stood on the mountain, which is to the east of the city. Which mountain is to the east of Jerusalem? It's the Mount of Olives. To this day, even in Orthodox Judaism, the Mount of Olives is considered Messiah's mountain. And they believe that when Messiah comes, he will descend on the Mount of Olives. Where did Jesus often go with his disciples to get away and have meditation and teaching? The Mount of Olives. Where was Golgotha, where Jesus was crucified? The Mount of Olives. Where did Jesus meet his disciples before he ascended back into heaven? The Mount of Olives. And the angel says he's coming back in the same way he's gone, meaning probably the Mount of Olives when Jesus comes back. And so, look at what Ezekiel said today. The glory of Yahweh came back into this temple he saw by way of the gate facing east. It stood on the Mount of Olives, but then it came back into the temple through the gate facing east. What did Jesus do on Palm Sunday? As soon as Jesus was approaching Jerusalem, near the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole crowd of disciples began praising God and shouting, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of Yahweh, peace in heaven and glory in the highest." And once Jesus descended the Mount of Olives through the Kidron Valley, and he went up in Jerusalem through which gates? The east gate. What's the first thing Jesus did as soon as he entered the east gate? He went right into the temple and drove out those who were selling goods. You can see the eastern gate there of the old city of Jerusalem, and you can see off to the left there how the east gate has a direct corridor right into that temple courts. And so once again, in Jesus, the glory of Yahweh did come right down the Mount of Olives, right through that eastern gate, and right into the temple, just as Ezekiel foresaw. You can't get more personal than that. That in Jesus Christ, God in all of his glory tabernacled and templed among us. Do you remember his burning desire? The gospel truth that the God of the universe from eternity to eternity wants nothing more. He has this burning, relentless desire to dwell with you physically and visibly as his dear children. We can go to the very end of the Bible now and see what your eternity is going to look like. John writes in Revelation 21, "I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for this one is gone." And then he says of that new creation, "I saw the new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God. And I heard a loud voice from that throne saying, 'Behold, the tabernacle of God is right here with man. And God will tabernacle, tent, with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them.'" And then he goes on to say, "And I saw no temple in that city, for its temple is Yahweh God and the Lamb. And the city has no need of sun or moon to light on it, because the glory of God gives it light. And its lamp is the Lamb." What's your eternity? Through Jesus Christ, God in the fullness of his glory is going to dwell physically and visibly with you. But unlike Moses and those priests, you're not going to have to run out. And unlike Ezekiel, you're not going to have to see that glory and fall on your face. Because we will behold and bask in the fullness of his glory there, face to face, forever. God's burning desire to just live with you. Some questions to think about from these words of Ezekiel, and I know that was a lot of ground. What stood out to you today from God's word? And how does the God of the universe's relentless desire to dwell with you physically and visibly forever, how does that alter you now? Begin to think about that, and then we'll have some more time to process through that and share with those you are with when we come to our upper room time.